so many developments have come in Hexarohelian theory of international trade. Some were inconsistent with the factor endowment theory or Hexarohelian theory, and some were not in line with the Hexarohelian theory. Here, let us look at such a development in the Hexarohelian theory. Welcome to the new video. Today we have factor price equalization theory put forward by Paul A. Samuelson. Factor price equalization theory is an extension of the Hexarohelian theory. It is Hexarohelian theory's substantiation as well. This is on factor prices and trade. The factor price equalization theorem examines how does trade affect factor prices in both nations. So what impact would trade make on factor prices in both nations? A trade could bring some changes in the prices of labor and capital. So finally, factor prices will be equal due to international trade. But how does it happen? How does the factor price equalization happen? Here the argument is trade in commodities leads to equalization of prices of factors in both nations. So what do you think? Will it be possible? In fact, as per the Hexarohelian theory, trade happens when there are some differences in factor proportions or capital labor ratio in both nations. So capital will be costlier in labor abundant nations and cheaper in capital abundant nations. Similarly, labor will be cheaper in labor abundant nations and labor will be costlier in capital abundant nations. So to speak, capital will be costlier in India, which is a labor surplus country, and capital will be cheaper in the United States, which is a capital surplus nation. Similarly, labor will be cheaper in India, which is a labor surplus country, and labor will be costlier in the United States as it is a labor short or capital surplus nation. So initially factor prices are not equal in both nations, but eventually it will come to equal prices in both nations due to the impact of international trade. Before going into the details, let us look the assumptions first. So as I said, this is factor price equalization theorem is in line with the Hexarohelian theorem. So as its assumptions as well, all the assumptions of Hexarohelian theorem are also the assumptions of factor price equalization theorem as well. So to speak, the Hexarohelian theory is formed in the framework of competitive market. There will be free trade in both nations. There will not be any imperfection in the market. There will be no factor mobility across the borders. Capital and labor will be mobile only inside the nation. It will not be across the borders. So there is no international factor mobility, and all factors are homogeneous in both nations. That means the capital will be homogeneous in capital abundant nation and labor abundant nation. Labor will be homogeneous in labor abundant nation as well as in capital abundant nation. So there will not be any heterogeneity. There will be homogeneity of factors in terms of productivity, and there will be same factor intensity in both nations for same commodity. That means the agriculture will be labor intensive in India, agriculture will be labor intensive in the United States as well. Similarly, the aircraft manufacturing will be capital intensive in the United States, and the same aircraft manufacturing industry will be capital intensive in India as well. How is factor price equalization possible in both nations due to international trade? As you all know, trade is governed by the differences in comparative advantage, or trade is driven by the differences in comparative advantage. Capital, that means the capital abundant nations export capital intensive commodities, on which the capital abundant nations have the comparative advantage. Similarly, labor abundant nations export labor intensive commodities on which labor abundant nations have got the comparative advantage. Here, the nations use their abundant factors more, as abundant factor will be cheaper. So they have the advantage over those commodities. That means the abundant factors of a nation will be used more for the production of the commodities on which the nation is specializing. As more of the abundant factors use, the price of the abundant factors will eventually increase. With more and more abundant factors are employed in the production of the commodities on which the nation is specializing. At the same time, the scarce factors is on lower demand, as less of scarce factors will be employed after international trade or after specialization. After specialization, the nation will focus on the commodities on which they have the comparative advantage. So to speak, the demand for abundant factors will increase, so as the price. Similarly, the demand for scarce factor will come down, and so as the price of scarce factors will come down. After specialization, more of commodities on which the nation has the comparative advantage will be produced more. That means the abundant factors will be on higher demand. Its price will increase as more and more abundant factors are employed. Similarly, the scarce factors will not be employed more, so the demand for the scarce factors will come down, so as the price of scarce factors. So this is possible in international trade as per the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, and also as per the factor price equalization theorem. The same will happen in opposite nation in tandem. That means, shortly speaking, after international trade or after specialization, capital abundant nations employ more of capital and less of labor. Then the price of capital will increase and price of labor will come down. In the capital abundant nations, the price of capital will increase and price of labor will come down. In the capital abundant nations, are as capital abundant nations specialize in capital intensive commodities, so use of capital will be higher and use of labor will be lower, so the price of capital will increase and price of labor will come down in the capital abundant nations. Similarly, in the labor abundant nations, they employ more of they employ more of labor and less of capital. Then the demand for labor will increase and price of labor will increase eventually. Similarly, the demand and price of capital will come down in the labor abundant nations, as the labor abundant nations focus on labor intensive commodities. Finally, prices of factors will be equal after international trade in both nations. So this is the factor price equalization theorem. This will be materialized because of international trade, because of specialization. So I have an example for you. We have India and the United States. India is a labor abundant country. The United States is a capital abundant country. India produces cotton produced more by labor, and so the demand for labor will be higher and the price of labor will be increasing as its demand is high. Then price of capital is lower, it will come down as less of capital is employed in the labor intensive commodities which is produced by India, which is a labor surplus country. Similarly, the United States produce aircraft engine which is produced more by capital, so the demand for capital will increase. After international trade, the price of capital also will increase as more and more capital is employed for the production of aircraft engine manufacturing. Yeah. Similarly, the price of labor will come down as less of labor is employed in the production of capital intensive commodities. after specialization. Let's look the price of factors before international trade, before specialization. Before trade in labor abundant country. First, let's look the price of labor before international trade. In the labor abundant country, the price of labor will be cheaper. That means the price of labor is lower and price of capital is higher in a labor abundant country like India, which is a labor surplus country or capital short country. So abundant factors will be cheaper, scarce factors will be costlier. This is the case. Similarly, in capital abundant country before international trade, the capital will be cheaper and labor will be dearer. But what will happen after international trade and after specialization? In labor abundant country after international trade, demand for labor will increase and price of labor will increase. Similarly, the demand for capital will come down, price of capital will come down. Then similarly in capital abundant country after international trade or after specialization, demand and price of capital will rise as more and more capital is employed. Demand and price of labor will fall in capital abundant nation as less of labor is employed in capital abundant nations. So finally the prices in two nations will come to an equilibrium will be arrived after international trade. So this is the factor price equalization theorem. This is in line actually with the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. This factor price equalization theorem is put forward by Paul A. Samuelson. This is in fact an extension of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem and substantiation of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem.